This is The World This Weekend. Hello, I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Ceremonies to mark the third National Day of Truth and Reconciliation have taken place across the country.
The unmarked graves of the children woke this country up.
Governor General Mary Simon among those who spoke at the event in Ottawa, and in the audience, survivors and their families who shared their stories.
My dad went to residential school, so for me it's important to be here with them.
Also coming up, a warning from global public health experts about malaria.
We've reached the perfect storm. If we do not act now, all the gains we've made over the last 20 years will be eroded.
That's later, but first. In Ottawa, more than 1,000 people gathered on Parliament Hill today for the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. The federal holiday, now in its third year, recognizes the legacy and irreparable harms the country's residential school system caused to Indigenous peoples and honors the Indigenous children who did not make it back home. Rafi Bujikanian was at the ceremony.
For years, Eddie Pazendawach was tongue-tied about what he endured at residential school. Now his music does the talking for the crowds gathered on Parliament Hill.
I call it residential school song.
For Indigenous people, the legacy of residential schools goes hand in hand with Canada's history itself. But it's only the third year the country is officially marking National Day for Truth and Reconciliation.
Yeah, it's about time. Because it takes time, because we do that now for 3-4 years now.
Fred Kistabish is a survivor.
And myself, I went to 2 residential therapy houses in order to try to repair what happened to myself.
His daughter Javette is here too. She says the schooling system attempted to erase all of her father's identity.
They were not able to allow to speak their language. They even tried to change his name.
But not every survivor's daughter here had the chance to bring their parents to the event.
I was raised Catholic. I didn't believe that there was actually anything happening, and same as my brother.
By the time Rocky Ward learned the truth, she hesitated to bring it up with her dad, who has since passed away.
Because he also went to the army, so he had a lot of PTSD. That I wasn't a therapist, so I didn't want to open up things that I couldn't help him close safely.
And for all those who cannot speak about the past, a moment. Volunteers carrying a long red banner stretching across much of the lawn on Parliament Hill, the names of children who did not survive residential school etched on its fabric. The National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation has identified 4,000 who never came back.
Canada as a country is beginning to listen to those stories.
Among the speakers today, Canada's Governor General Mary Simon, the first Indigenous person appointed to the role, forced to attend day school herself for part of her childhood, where she was not allowed to speak her native Inuktitut.
Certainly our national history needs to reflect the challenges, trauma, joys, experiences, knowledge and culture of Indigenous peoples and lives.
That message targeting Canadians too, but others here are for Indigenous people. Like this from Angela Carrar, who went to a school herself.
Be kind to one another. Respect each other in values and traditional ways. Forgive and let love rule your day. We are never victims. We are survivors.
Rafi Bujikanian, CBC News, Ottawa.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau marked the day in Lac La Ronge in northern Saskatchewan. He took part in what was called an awareness march with members of the local Indigenous community and says today isn't just for Indigenous people.
Reconciliation is the action and the responsibility of every single person who lives today on Turtle Island. Every single one of us have to understand not just what happened in the past, but the impacts that that past has in very real things today.
Lac La Ronge is the site of two residential schools that burned down in the early 1900s. The Prime Minister stopped at a monument to the children who attended both facilities. He then visited a cemetery just meters away, where a search with ground-penetrating radar uncovered a number of unmarked graves in late 2021. While the painful process of reconciliation is front and centre in Manitoba's provincial election. For months, there have been calls for police to search a Winnipeg landfill for the remains of two Indigenous women believed to be the victims of an alleged serial killer. Premier Heather Stephenson refused, citing the high cost and the potential danger. Now her Progressive Conservative Party is making their opposition to the search a key pillar of their re-election campaign. Karen Pauls reports.
Protests outside a Progressive Conservative political announcement and at leader Heather Stephenson's campaign office.
So we're here to fight today to fight against her.
Jordan Myron's 26-year-old sister Mercedes is one of the Indigenous women police believe was killed, then dumped in a landfill.
We need to bring them home to give them a proper burial.
Stephenson has been clear for months she won't search the landfill, pointing to asbestos and other toxic chemicals as concerns.
Leaders have to make tough decisions. This is one of those tough decisions I had to make. I cannot, in good conscience, put workers' health at risk doing that when there is no guarantee of finding the individuals that they're talking about, the bodies.
That message echoed in campaign billboards and a full-page newspaper ad which said, "Stand firm. For health and safety reasons, the answer on the landfill dig just has to be no."
For certain parties to make it an issue, that's not right.
The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs is among those denouncing the PCs for making this a political issue. Grand Chief Kathy Merrick says this is the opposite of reconciliation.
I'm very disheartened as to what's transpiring in this province when it comes to First Nation people.
Kelly Saunders is a political science professor at Brandon University. She says the PCs are trying to shore up their base at a time when public opinion polls suggest the NDP have a commanding lead.
They're making it an election issue. And usually when parties do that, it's because they really think they can get some ground on it in terms of getting votes.
The NDP say they'll work with the families and try to find the remains in the landfill. The Liberals say they'll use half the estimated $184 million budget to search. The PCs are defending their position.
And we have put money towards making sure that it never happens again.
Kevin Klein was the Minister of Climate and Environment before the election was called. He's running for re-election.
I think the question really is where is the federal government on this position? We've made our position fairly clear that the federal government now has the opportunity to do the right thing and make a decision and make it public.
This week, the protesters set up another blockade at Winnipeg's main landfill. Indigenous elder Jerry Shingoose had this message for Heather Stephenson.
Focus should be on the families only at this time, not the election, not the politics, and she shouldn't be bringing harm to the families.
Meanwhile, NDP leader Wab Kinew says there's another way to send a message.
You have in your hands a tool that is more powerful than any blockade and more powerful than any protest, and that is your ballot.
Manitobans go to the polls on Tuesday, just days after the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a day the PCs have repeatedly refused to recognize as a provincial holiday. Karen Pauls, CBC News, Winnipeg.
In Saskatchewan, Premier Scott Moe is threatening to invoke the notwithstanding clause over a controversial school pronoun policy. Moe's government wants schools to get parents' permission to change the names or pronouns of students under age 16. The notwithstanding clause gives parliaments the power to override parts of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for 5 years when passing legislation. To find out why it's being brought up now, I spoke to CBC's Jason Warwick. He joined us from Saskatoon. So, Jason, invoking the notwithstanding clause is rare. Can you take us through why Premier Moe plans to use it now?
Sure, Stephanie. Earlier this week, a Saskatchewan judge placed an injunction on the controversial school pronoun policy of the Saskatchewan government, and that essentially placed the policy on hold. And the judge said there was absolutely no evidence that the government did any meaningful consultation with parents, teachers, or kids, and no evidence that they did any research on the issue. That was part of the reason that the injunction was placed, in a sense, waiting until the government could prove its case in court later this fall. But hours later, Premier Scott Moe said he'd be invoking the notwithstanding clause to override that court decision, and it would go in place well before this other full court matter. Moe plans to recall the legislature October 10th to invoke this notwithstanding clause, Stephanie.
This whole issue reminds us of New Brunswick, right? Where a similar policy led to discord within Premier Blaine Higgs's party. What kind of support does Premier Moe have? Is his party and his cabinet behind him on this?
Right. Well, perhaps a similar policy between the two provinces, but appearing to be a completely different political calculus here. In Saskatchewan here, Premier Moe's cabinet and his party on almost every issue, as with this one, appear totally unified publicly. At the same time, the NDP opposition is totally united in its opposition to this policy. So a real chasm, a wide gap between the two, as it is on many policies. And as expected, it's difficult to gauge public opinion when this is all so fresh, but a range of opinions on this, to be sure.
Well, speaking of public opinion, I mean, beyond the political sphere, how big a conversation is this in Saskatchewan in general?
It was big when it came up, and it's growing. But the nature of it seems to be changing. So in the early days, when this was first introduced, when other provinces were discussing this, it was mostly about this policy, about whether it's a good idea to have mandatory parental notification on identity changes. But now, after Premier Moe has pledged to use this notwithstanding clause, and the day is coming in a week or two, the debate is actually shifting now to the legality of his actions and his government's actions. And one side is saying he's sticking up for provincial interests. The other is saying he's making a mockery of the Canadian Constitution, Stephanie.
And if he does invoke this notwithstanding clause, and it sounds like he will, what happens next? Is the matter settled then? Is this over?
Well, in a word, no, it is not over. Legal experts we spoke with, they say that the opponents of the government policy, should the notwithstanding clause go into place as expected, they could actually apply for another injunction and to ask the judge to put it on pause again for constitutional reasons or for errors in law. And now if another judge decides to grant that, the government can appeal that injunction, and so on and so on and so on. So this could go on for a very long time. However, Canadian courts, as they note, have been extremely reluctant to intervene when it comes to the notwithstanding clause. And when a government actually invokes this, a court has never struck it down, Stephanie.
Okay, Jason, thanks so much for this.
Take care.
That was CBC's Jason Warwick in Saskatoon. In the U.S., the House of Representatives has passed a stopgap funding bill just hours before a government shutdown is set to take place. The package would fund government services for the next 45 days until November 17th. A similar bill introduced last night was defeated partially by members of House Speaker Kevin McCarthy's own party. The new bill dropped multiple spending cuts that Republicans pushed for in order to get full support from Democrats. The temporary funding package now goes to the U.S. Senate for approval, then to the White House. If the deal is not in place by midnight, millions of federal workers will not be paid, and many programs and services will face disruptions or stop entirely. Nearly the entire population of Nagorno-Karabakh has fled into Armenia. The enclave is formally recognized as part of Azerbaijan, but the majority of its population was made up of ethnic Armenians until a recent surge in violence. The mass exodus was triggered by Azerbaijan's military reclaiming control over the breakaway region. Armenia is now calling on the European Union for temporary shelters and medical supplies to help it manage the tens of thousands of refugees. The CBC's Briar Stewart was in Armenia's capital, where she visited a center collecting donations for refugees.
People have been dropping off food and diapers and toiletries, toys. These are all volunteers from individuals and companies, and it's an effort that's organized by a local actress. Her name is Ines Sargarian.
And people all coming here, and all these hungry baby crying. They haven't home, they haven't chateaus, and they have anything. And it's little what we can do for them now.
And we know that Armenia said that they can only host about 40,000 refugees, and many more than that have come in. So it's really a lot of average residents, local citizens that are helping out, and they're hosting some of these refugee families. So you have cars that are parked here, and they pick up donations as they're ready to send them out.
Briar Stewart reporting from Yerevan, Armenia. Well, the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh and Russia's invasion of Ukraine were two of the key issues facing world leaders at the UN General Assembly. But on the sidelines, there was another issue that got far fewer headlines: eradicating malaria. The killer disease was at one point on the path to extinction. Now global health advocates are warning of a looming malaria emergency. Chris Reyes explains what's causing the dangerous backslide.
We're calling on the whole world in terms of calling attention to the crisis that we have, the looming emergency, the looming threat around malaria.
Dr. Michael Adekunle Charles is the CEO of RBM Partnership to End Malaria. He says that warning is more urgent than ever as climate change brings hotter temperatures and stronger storms, creating breeding grounds for the mosquitoes that transmit the disease. Add to that, mosquitoes are growing more resistant to insecticides, while anti-malarial drugs are also becoming less effective, all while funding for interventions has plateaued in recent years.
We've reached the perfect storm. If we do not act now, all the gains we've made over the last 20 years will be eroded.
That's echoed by global health advocates and African leaders, the continent most affected by malaria. Dr. Muhammad Ali Patey is Nigeria's health minister. He recently visited a facility in his country that reflects the urgency of treating the disease.
60-70% of kids who were in that facility had malaria. Those were preventable cases.
Around 600,000 people die from malaria each year, and 247 million people are infected. That, according to the most recent numbers from the World Health Organization. Earlier this year, the U.S. recorded its first locally acquired malaria cases in 20 years. Dr. Patey's message: don't let malaria burden healthcare systems that are already maxed out.
If the public health measures are deployed in an effective manner, I think it saves money, it saves lives, it also saves the entire healthcare system.
Olivia Ngu is the executive director of Impact Santé Afrique, a public health NGO based in Cameroon. She says malaria is a public health emergency waiting to happen, but it doesn't have to be that way.
It's a disease we can prevent and we can treat. We have the tools for it. So we don't understand why we will lose anyone to this disease. We need about more than 1 billion over the next 3 years to cover the gap in the malaria fight.
The biggest challenge in fundraising, says Dr. Charles, fighting for attention. Malaria, a disease that slipped into the background as newer, more intense crises have emerged in recent years.
The longer we wait, the longer the crisis, the more, susceptible the mosquito is to resistance and all that, and the gap will continue to widen.
Malaria advocates are holding out hope that the disease can still be eradicated by 2030 if that funding gap is filled now. Chris Reyes, CBC News, New York.
Here in Canada, infectious diseases experts warn drug-resistant bacteria are an increasing danger. Around the world, more than 1 million people each year die from antibiotic-resistant infections. And a recent report found Canada is lacking in the latest drugs needed to fight these bugs. Amina Zafar now with the story of one man who is still recovering from infections he contracted while undergoing routine surgery.
I got out of the truck and started to projectile vomit.
Glenn Barr can't forget that day on his driveway.
Incredible amounts of blood.
Right here?
Yeah, right here.
Barr sought out medical advice and found he needed a new liver.
Doctors would open up my charts, and if it was a new doctor, you'd hear the oh my.
On top of Barr's new liver, the Ottawa resident caught a slew of serious infections.
E. coli, hepatitis.
Including one right in the surgical cut from his transplant.
There was an infection with the incision, and that turned out to be something that required them to cut it open and take the incision out and then treat the internal area for months.
Doctors gave Barr IV antibiotics to treat one of his bacterial infections so it wouldn't spread in his body.
We can get really difficult to manage bacterial infections, and so that's an important priority.
Elon Schwartz is a Canadian infectious diseases specialist, now working at Duke University in North Carolina. Antibiotics, like penicillin, are meant to kill off bacteria, but the bacteria can evolve a resistance to the drugs, which makes infections really hard to treat.
That's the future that infectious disease doctors really worry about.
Schwartz worries even worse infections, or superbugs, are not just threatening the immunocompromised, but could infect more patients, including Canadians going to the hospital for routine surgeries like hip replacements.
In this arms race against the bacteria, we inevitably lose.
Jerry Wright invents new antibiotics at his lab at McMaster University.
But we're always going to have these outbreaks and epidemics of things that we never even considered to be an issue.
Wright worries more outbreaks will happen. He says the COVID pandemic is an example of how unprepared our healthcare system can be.
We had an enormous lesson given to us, spanking by nature.
For now, hospital cleaners work to keep the superbugs out and vulnerable patients like Glenn Barr safe.
Can I get you some water for your pills?
Please.
4 years later, Barr is still recovering from the infections he picked up after his liver transplant. Amina Zephyr, CBC News, Toronto.
In the new movie Solo, an up-and-coming drag queen commands the stage at Montreal bars while also struggling with an abusive lover and an absent mother. It's a showcase of Montreal's drag scene, and as the CBC's Tegan Beaudet reports, the filmmakers say it's coming out at a critical time.
Quebecois director Sophie Dupuis was a fan of drag culture for years before making Solo.
I get to listen to them talking about their lives, their family, where they're coming from. I thought that there may be like something to say about that.
The buzzy new French-language film follows a young drag queen named Simon. He gets involved with someone new, and at first things seem great. But the relationship ultimately alienates everyone in Simon's life. Dupuis says she wanted to tell a story about LGBTQ characters for whom queerness is never an issue. And the first step, auditioning hundreds of LGBTQ actors.
I thought it was a good idea to have mostly queer people to work with. It was very emotional because people were telling how important that kind of film would be for the culture and even for them. That was maybe a kind of film that they will need when they were young.
Dupuis wrote the lead role for Théodore Pellerin. He's a Quebecois actor who had to learn to walk in heels, and he says value his own femininity.
The character, is completely liberated in that matter and values himself through that extravagance and that femininity. And so I had to develop that and also learn to love it.
The film's release comes at a time when drag performances are drawing angry protests across North America. And hate crimes targeting LGBTQ people are rising dramatically. That's according to data from Statistics Canada. Still, Montreal-based drag queen Giselle Lullaby says there is much to celebrate in Canada's drag scene. She says the film is a touching window into the Montreal drag world.
And I think it's important to see a movie like that to understand what is going on inside, not just judging people like.
And she says while audiences shouldn't expect RuPaul's Drag Race level budgets for the costumes in the movie, Dupuis got a lot right about Montreal's local drag queens. Solo won the Best Canadian Film Award at this year's Toronto International Film Festival. It opens in Toronto this weekend and across Canada on October 6th. Tegan Beaudet, CBC News, Toronto.
You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. As Canada marks the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, Australia is grappling with its own colonial history and treatment of Indigenous peoples. In 2 weeks' time, it'll hold a national referendum. Voters will decide whether or not Indigenous people will have a guaranteed voice in Australia's parliament. Sasha Petrusik reports.
Outside a school north of Sydney, kids dance and sing an Indigenous tune. It's in Darawal, a fading language now being taught to Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal youngsters. Thousands of children may eventually take these classes, says Ray Ingray, the head of the foundation behind the program.
We can't continue to sanitise what our old people went through. And once that's acknowledged by everybody, we can then move forward together.
It's part of Australia's attempt to kickstart a dialogue on Aboriginal rights, one that went into high gear this week with the announcement of a national referendum by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese.
A way for all of us to recognise Indigenous Australians and their history in our Constitution.
Aboriginal peoples make up just over 3% of Australia's population, marginalised and socially disadvantaged, and have no treaties. Proposed changes would create a so-called Voice to Parliament, an Indigenous committee to advise lawmakers. Campaigning for the Yes forces started right away, with placard-waving groups from Darwin to Sydney.
I think Indigenous people absolutely have the right to be written within the Constitution. They need to be able to come together and make some decisions for their people and their communities.
But polls suggest Australians aren't convinced.
It has caused nothing but harm and division.
And even some Indigenous leaders, like Independent Senator Lydia Thorpe, reject the referendum as just window dressing.
There won't be change until this society changes, until this society's thinking, values, attitudes and systems have been revolutionised.
Nigan Sinclair from the University of Winnipeg says Canada could use a similar national dialogue now, since support for Indigenous rights has dropped.
Some people are calling it reconciliation fatigue. That's setting throughout the country because people are feeling the crunch of money. And whenever there's a crunch of money, Indigenous rights are always pushed aside.
Things may not change in Australia this time either, partly because of attitudes, partly because of referendum rules. To pass, it needs majority support in most states, as well as nationally. Sasha Petrusik, CBC News, Toronto.
To end our show tonight, we want to take you back to the ceremony and bring you more of one deeply moving moment, a tribute to the children known to have died at residential schools. Here's Stephanie Scott, the Executive Director of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, or NCTR, and herself a 60s scoop survivor.
The residential school system was intended to destroy First Nations, Inuit, and Métis cultures and our languages, but they did not succeed. For those that never made it home, their spirits call out to us to be remembered and to be honored.
Those children's names, more than 4,000 of them, written onto a long red banner and carried to the stage, where tiny shoes were placed in honor of the children whose names aren't yet known.
We still don't have all the records. The NCTR continues to work with churches, governments, and others so we can finally access the 23 million records that were not released to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. We know more children will be found and their names will be added.
The founding director of the NCTR is Métis artist Ry Moran, who played his song Feel You Here during the banner procession.
I feel you here.
We'll leave you with some more of Ry Moran. This has been The World This Weekend. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Thank you for being with us.
Here I feel